It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the final panel of the first day of this wonderful conference. The panel is titled Figures of Loss, Exile, Melancholy, and Memory in Literature and Film. And we will have only two speakers with us, which is Piera Rossetto and Laetitia Simcha Ohayon, who is on Zoom. Who is with us already. Yes, welcome. Welcome, Laetitia. So let me start while Laetitia is still fixing her connection issues. Let me start with the introduction of Piera. Piera Rossetto is assistant professor at Foscari University of Venice. Piera has been working on performance, memories and identities by Jews from Libya. And on this very topic, she published Juifs de Libye, Constellation de Mémoire. And at the moment and currently, she's working under her new research project, Gender, Aging and Migration, Memory and Jewish Masculinities from North Africa and the Middle East. And on that research, her paper is going to be based. And Laetitia is an alumna of... Laetitia, are you with us? Yes, you are. Fantastic. Yes. And you can hear us. Yes, and we can see you well. Okay, that's a good news. Is alumna of Bannon College of Columbia University with a degree in the medical humanities in French and English and psychoanalysis. Her research addresses intergenerational memory and transmission, interrelational contemporary psychoanalysis, and post-decolonial Judeo-Maghrebi literature. So we'll divide our time between these two speakers, and we move from Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah, so we are going to... It's muted. We're going to experience a dramatic shift in topics, so we're going to move into poetry. So if you fall asleep, I won't get offended. I mean, you can rest a little bit from the very heavy stuff of political memory, wonderful papers that we heard so far. It's also the first time that I present this topic. And mind the translation. I'm presenting in particular. I'm reading closely a poem, right? Originally written in Hebrew, which I translated into Italian, and I translated into English for today. So first of all, the translation is not yet, really ready for publication, and I beg your pardon because even the English translation is for sure not accurate how it should be. But I accepted the invitation to come, and thank you for accepting my proposal. But yeah, it's a kind of test in this sense. So if you don't mind to put the PowerPoint, thank you. Because I also put some of the most important, relevant quotations from the poem here. And it's a dialogue, so you will see that I'm changing colors of the background according to the person who is speaking, right? It's more a kind of suggestive than crucial to read, right? Okay, so in 1996, anthropologist Keith Basso published his book, Wisdom Sits in Places, Landscape and Language Among the Western Apache. And until today, the book remains a point of reference for expanding the awareness of what place can mean to people. In our context today, we could also say that memory sits in places, with no need to quote Maurice Holbach's or Pierre Nora and the fundamental role in unveiling the multiple ways and scales in which memory takes place. So my reference to Basso is not by accident, and in fact, he was also called a patient listener of landscapes. So it's not by accident. My reading of Vicky Shiran's poetry, and in particular the text that I will discuss today, benefit a lot from readings in literary geography. In particular, I joined the conversation of the conference, Memories, Narratives and Conflicts, inspired by the way literary geography deploys spatial theory in close critical reading, and I ask first, where does memory sit in Shiran's poetry? And second, how does the conflict of memories take place in her literary production? So these questions led my exploration of the poem Be'emet HaTorah Mavki, Truly the Torah, It Makes Cry, by the Egyptian-born Mizrahi feminist and socio-political activist Vicky Shiran. To the first question, essentially the poem delves into that complex bond between daughter and father that Iraqi-born Israeli author Sami Michael described as a riddle in the riddle. To the first question, I will answer that memory sits in details. By close reading the 11 stanzas poem, the paper shows how Shiran's intimate portrait of a relationship with the father operates as a luminous detail which sheds light on the microgeographies of conflicting memories among new immigrants in Israel, well beyond the family dimension. The poem, in fact, unveils how the relationship formed and was shaped by Shiran's family migration from Egypt to Israel in the 1950s. As for the second question, I will argue that the riddle of conflicting memories takes place in the poetic space, which is constructed through language and form as movement, in the oscillatory modus of narration that permeates the whole poem. This movement takes shape both through the dialogue between father and daughter, on which the poem's stanzas are built, and through a detailed description of the spaces, from the claustrophobic space of the bathroom, where the poem opens, to the open space of the sea and its promenade. Just a few details about Vicky Shiran. So Victorine Vicky Ben Natan was born in Cairo in 1947 to a family of Egyptian Jews, married to Chaim Shiran, a Moroccan-Israeli Jewish TV producer and filmmaker. She passed away in 2004 in Tel Aviv after years of fighting against a cancer diagnosis. Vicky Shiran's family moved to Israel in 1951 and experienced economic hardships to the point that at the age of 13, Shiran was obliged to leave the school and start working to support the family. So the parents and her 3 siblings. Thanks to her strong will, Shiran managed to complete her higher education by studying in the evenings. She graduated in Hebrew literature and history, but then she obtained an MA and a PhD in criminology. And in Israel, and I can say more if you're interested, in Israel, she's recognized as a founding figure of anti-occupation, feminist and Mizrahi activism. And here you see a picture of young Black Panthers in Israel, so a movement of Jews, young Middle Eastern and African Jews against the mostly European Ashkenazi establishment, and she was one of the funders and really supportive of the project. Henriette Dehan Kalev, a Moroccan-born Israeli professor and the founders and leading theorist of the Mizrahi feminist movement, affirms that Vicky Shiran left her mark on 3 major fields in Israel public life: peace, the Mizrahi struggle for justice, activism, and feminism. Right? This is Achoti, a mixed. It was a mixed movement of female or feminist movement in Israel. So Shiran perceived the peace activism, feminism, and Mizrahi struggle as interconnected in her life. She was a very, a tireless woman who invested her energies and creativity in promoting social justice and an equal share in rights and opportunities for all. But she was also a fine poet, as witnessed by the collection Shoveret Kir. You see it here. So, She Who Breaks the Wall, which was published posthumously. So my first encounter with Shiran's poem took place while I was exploring, as it was announced, the figure of the father in recollections by 1.5 and second generation of Mizrahi authors, so Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. The larger historical framework is the forced migration of Jews from Muslim-majority countries. So between the 1940s and 1970s, the departures of roughly 800,000 individuals from Middle Eastern and North African lands was one of the most significant demographic transformations in modern Jewish history. More specifically, my interest lied in the impact that this migration and resettlement process had on men and in the formation of what we can call misplaced masculinities. Within this research framework, one poem in particular retained my attention, Be'emet HaTorah Mavki'a, which features a complex dialogue between daughter and father, Egyptian Jews, and the post-migration time in Israel. The poem sheds light on the conflicting relationship and memories thereof between daughter and father by drawing the reader into a movement, a sort of oscillation between the claustrophobic space of a bathroom, the father is sitting on the toilet and cries, and the open landscape of the sea, the Mediterranean. Between the fond childhood memories by the child author of Saturday evenings strolling at the seaside, and the sense of humiliation of the father, the erosion of his masculinity, which still haunts him when he remembers those same walks, and we will see why. On the one hand, the oscillation movement, the affectionate memories of the blue of the sea that wraps around her shoulders like a shawl, transforming the child into a lady, Madame, in the poem. And on the other hand, the legs of the mother, swollen from too much walking, which transforms her, such a woman, the lady, into an awkward creature dragging herself along the street. The vastness of the open space of the sea on the one extreme, and at the opposite end, the claustrophobic space of the bus, people packed like sardines, standing as if they were prisoners anxious for the hour of fresh air. This oscillatory movement permeates the whole poem, and the pendulum as a concrete object does appear in the last stanza, in its closing line. The daughter embodies the movement of a repeated oscillation, moving towards the father and then running away from him. The movement of approaching and receding is repeated like a swing of a pendulum. The repetition is given by a particular construction of the verbs to run away, to approach, and to get away, with the verb alach, to go, the construction denoting the continuous repetition of that particular action. The father, instead, is not represented by a verbal element, but by the pendulum object. I keep running away from him, I keep getting closer, I keep getting further away, a little girl hanging for years from a broken pendulum. The pendulum father is broken, and indeed, the broken father, broken by the trauma of forced migration and unsuccessful resettlement, is a recurring theme in novels and autobiographical text by Mizrahi authors. The rhymes of the first two lines of the poem, where the daughter speaks in the first person, reproduced the rhythm of the pendulum swing. Hitrid oti inyan haze, gever boche bevet kise. Until suddenly, they shatter against the exclamation of what sounds like a voiceover. Maze gever. And then back to the daughter. Abba Sheli. Translation. This thing bothered me. A man crying in the bathroom. And what a man! My father. The father is locked in the bathroom, sitting on the toilet, crying. The tears are falling warm and softly on the knees. The daughter goes to him and asks, "Why are you sitting in the bathroom?" "What can I do?" he replies. The father declares himself full of complaints, full of self-pity, crying secretly, he says, "so that the children won't see, so that your mother, such a woman, won't think I'm not a man." The second stanza opens with a detailed description of the daughter, how she looks like and how she stands in relation to the father, both physically and emotionally. She stands towering over the father. Her hairstyles are held in place by 2 red knitting needles. And on her chest, she wears a bird for decoration, she says. This is a descriptive detail, the bird, that deserves attention because it will appear again in the text in 2 other points. In stanza 6, the father reveals to his daughter that her fond memories of the family walks along the seafront instead are, to him, a dreadful recollection, still tormenting him. At this point, the conflict of memory explodes. In the following stanza, with a heated tone, the daughter rebels against this revelation, and the bird vibrates against her breast, as if her chest, hers or the bird's, were swelling to speak with even more force. Is this what you tell God? Do you think he doesn't see? You might have thought it was temporary or by mistake. Books tell a lot of ragged princes, witches, and terrible curses. But in the end, God, the father, reacts vehemently, jumping to his feet as if he had been stung. "And what do you think I do in the bathroom? Oh, stupid fool, I tell God precisely this. I make vows, I do calculations, I remind him in detail that I am a ragged prince and not just another poor wretch." Her response is chilling. It encapsulates the disintegration of the daughter's childhood illusions about her father, and this is metaphorically represented by the disintegration of her hairstyle, the one she wore at the beginning of the poem, which kept her hair tied up and in place. She abandons the nasal, childish tone of girls praying at being ladies. And even the decoration, the bird, is thrown in the garbage. Everything seems to dismantle. "You are not a ragged prince. My voice is cold as ice. My eyes frozen, my hair disheveled. The bird is thrown in the garbage. A ragged prince is a prince in spirit. Rags are the dirt of life, and you alone should have given hope and not locked yourself in the bathroom, leaving me alone to watch as my father, the prince of my soul, breaks like a broomstick." I will go back to the detail of the bird later in the paper. In the final lines of the stanza, still following a swinging movement, it is now the daughter who remembers when she, as a child, cried like her father at the beginning of the poem, behind the bathroom door where her father was crying. She hid her face in her hands, not wanting to be seen in tears by him. Why do I insist on the idea of the oscillation of the pendulum and not simply, for example, of mirroring. So the experience of one being reflected into that of the other. It is the father himself who, in his final reply to his daughter, makes it clear that their experiences are distinct. They are not blurred into each other like a reflection in the mirror. Your story, Habibti, in Arabic, is not my story, he tells here. And yet, the two stories equal each other. My story is mine. Yours is yours. I cried for you, and you cried for me. Kef kef, in Arabic again. We are equal, and the score is clear. With a strange whisper, he adds, how true the Torah is. Your story makes me cry, but mine too. Know that. Each one has their own story. Although the stories equal each other and the verb, with the adjectival function meuzanim, indicates the two plates of the scale, which are in equilibrium, they are not the same. In a way, the material on each plate is different. The final stanza concludes the poem precisely by mobilizing the pendulum both as an object and as a movement of oscillations, the line we saw earlier in the chapter. So this is a very intimate relationship at play here between a father and a daughter and their conflicting memories. Yet a detail, where does memory sit? Memory sits in details. A detail in the description of how the daughter looks and is dressed up invites us to expand the coordinates of this conversation, the bird on the chest. I stand in front of him, my hair is on two levels, pinned with two red knitting needles, and on my chest I have fastened a tufted bird as a decoration. And what do you get out of it, I say oddly, speaking through my nose, to put on ears, if no one sees you? The word describing the bird is revealing. Poetry is always vocalized in Hebrew. The punctuation system adds the vowels to the word, which is made of consonants. So one possible reading of the word without vocalization, metzayetzet, means tweeting, a tweeting bird, which would perfectly fit with the subject. However, the vowels point to another meaning, metzuyetzet, tufted, with a tuft, which is a common way to call the hopu. Interestingly, the hopu was chosen in 2008 on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the proclamation of the State of Israel as the Israeli national bird. In this sense, we can see the bird as a national symbol, the symbol of Israel, which is fastened on the chest, like something to be proud of, or that one wants to show out. However, continues the poet, it is for decoration. It is something superficially attached, not internalized, one can argue. Is it perhaps an entire generation of daughters and sons of immigrants who have pinned this symbol to their chest without perhaps internalizing it? Just to appear like everyone else, just to overcome the gap of not entirely belonging to the new country. Actually, Vicky Shiran passed away in 2004, before the hopu was chosen as the Israeli national bird. Am I taking Shiran's words and stretching them too far away in an act of over-interpretation? So by reading the poem closely, so close reading, that is by intertwining the semantic context and the thematic context, in this context, the history and struggle of the Mizrahim in Israel, as well as Shiran's biography, her writings, her political engagement, I argue that I'm not taking her words too far, and that the bird could represent a luminous detail like a skeleton key, which unlocks the shared logic of cultural discourses. In the case of the poem, the bird unlocks the discourse of conflicting memories across different layers and levels. In fact, when the conflict of memories begins to reveal itself, the image of the bird, the national symbol attached for decoration, begins to tremble, to vibrate. The waves of anger come to the surface and reach the animal image. And so, once again, I stand over him, the little bird trembling on my chest. Later, when the poet is confronted with the reality of a father who is not the prince of our soul, but a poor wretch like so many others, like so many other fathers broken by the failed experience of migration and resettlement, the fragility of that symbol hanging on the surface is also revealed. All that remains is to throw it in the trash. Is this what you tell God in the bathroom? You are not a ragged prince. My voice is cold as ice. My eyes frozen. Oh, sorry. My hair disheveled. The bird is thrown in the garbage. The detail, if you're interested in the second question, I will answer in the questions. I will finish this point properly. So in front of a father reduced to a poor wretch by the Israeli National Project of Ingathering the Exiles, the national symbol is thrown into the garbage. Against the backdrop of a rich literary production, both in prose and poetry by Mizrahi authors, which deals with the painful memories of the misplaced fathers, Shiran poems enshrines not only a personal narrative, but also a microcosm of collective experience, where moments of tenderness are shadowed by the burdens of expectation and the silences inherited between generations. The emotional tension unravels as Shiran's lines oscillate between nostalgia and a sense of displacement, mapping the fractured terrain of familial bonds against the backdrop of migration and loss. The detail of the tufted bird fastened on the chest could be an example of what David Greenham calls a node, a knot in the literary work, a point in the work where two or more contexts are activated, so areas of particularly literary density, which resonate in memory studies with Michael Rothberg's concept of nœud de mémoire. I had a second part on this oscillation between the landscape, the seafront promenade, these fond memories of the girl on the one side, and on the other side, this very recollection about the Saturday afternoon walks along the seaside were for the father tormenting because he couldn't offer to his wife nothing more than a promenade by bus and an ice cream. So this is another place where memory takes place actually between this oscillation between the macro and the micro in the recollection, particularly linked to a specific landscape. To conclude, by looking at where does memory sit in Shiran's poem in details, we realize that the poet actually maps a much larger phenomenon. So the conflicting memories of Jewish forced migrations from the Middle East and North Africa as they emerge in the intimate topographies of family and gender relations. By looking at how conflicting memories takes place in the poem, moving between different scales of places and spaces, Shiran unveils the way people constructed their sense of the world out of the interactions among places, spaces, and embodied practices, which is ultimately the aim of literary geography as a collective project. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this beautiful and very clearly given lecture. So for those of us who do not know much about the topic, it was both, a story about the migration to Israel as well, a fantastic lecture about how one can read a poem about displacement. And now we go to Laetitia. Laetitia, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
I'm going to share my screen for a presentation.
That would be fantastic.
Are you able to see the screen?
Yes, we can see the screen and we can hear you, so you can start.
Great. Thank you very much.
We don't see your face, but we see your slides, so maybe after the presentation, we just ask her to switch off the screen. And yeah, sorry, Laetitia, just go ahead.
No worries. Yes. So thank you so much for having me today.
Okay, I'm very sorry, Laetitia. Could you go into the full screen mode?
Yes. How about now?
Yeah.
Is this okay?
Yeah, it's perfect. Just if you could now see if you can really change the slides. Could you move to the second one just for a moment? Because sometimes it doesn't work. Yeah, it does. It works perfectly. Okay. Yeah. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah. So my name is Laetitia Ohayon. I majored in the medical humanities, which is essentially an umbrella term for comparative literature and psychoanalysis. And again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. And for organizing such an intentionally chosen group of projects. And my research primarily addresses memory and transmission, interrelational contemporary psychoanalysis, as well as post and colonial and decolonial literature. All right. So my most recent work is my thesis titled Writing Without Arriving, Cryptonomy and the Language of the Unconscious in Helen Sixou, which closely analyzes the psychoanalytic and political valence around constructing an identity with the help of deconstructuralist and post-structuralist literature, which easily extends to the present-day conversations about the self. I'm particularly drawn to what else one might mean when they claim or reject their identitarian markers. For example, author Helen Sixou inhabits this by acknowledging her French identity and also noting that she is not French by any real means. She writes, "What are you? Are you French? Who am I? Am I her?" And to answer with a word or a cross in the box when I would need 100 or a blank. She writes this in her text, My Algerians, published in 1998. How can we interpret this? Why is there not a third term to suit her position? A half Algerian, half Jewish, half German Jewish woman raised in Algeria and exiled to France. What happens when this conflict is transposed onto someone that had not actually experienced it? And what happens when it is communicated? Where is the rupture and where is the potential for repair and intergenerational difference? Thus, with this presentation, I hope to examine the psychic negotiation of inheriting a history or a memory, particularly memories of exile, war, displacement, transnationalism, through literature as a field of study. I was able to arrive at the above questions and conclusions through the research I'm presenting today, titled The Feeling of Loss, First and Second Generation Women Writers of Judeo-Maghrebi Origin on Assembly, Exile, and Melancholia. These projects would not have been possible without the help of Professor Eva Tartakovsky, who I thank greatly for inviting me to present our work. All right. So as the daughter of immigrants to France and the United States both, I've thought quite a bit about biculturalism and identity. Raised with my parents' stories, idiosyncrasies, resilience, I have asked and confirmed that it very well may be possible to embody the vicarious emotions or reactions linked to a parent's or family member's memories, experiences, or feel pain that one may have not lived themselves. To begin, I want to propose a sociological psychoanalytic eclipse to address the structure, function, and behavior of psychic or intergenerational conflict. So Karl Mannheim's seminal contribution to sociological theory is that the social world is structured by spatial coordinates, such as class position, social hierarchy, just as much as it is formed by a temporal dimension. Mannheim's lens offers that the dynamism of society emerges from groups whose interrelations are conditioned simultaneously by their spatial positioning within the social order and their historical temporal location. Psychoanalytically, however, the insertion of a traumatic experience into this societal dynamism is to confront the definition of trauma, which goes as a psychic wound that does not heal, nor should it aim to be cured, per se. In understanding its traits and methodology, trauma succeeds in transforming the world into its own image, secure in its capacity to recreate the experience for time immemorial, almost like a gap within time. It transmits an experience across generations so that the present is inhabited as the past, leaving the next generation without a clear social position or the autonomy to define itself completely anew. The convergence of Freud and Mannheim, as Jeffrey Prager puts it, quote, "When time becomes distorted as a result of overwhelming events, the natural distance between generations, demarcated by the passing of time and changing experience, becomes obscured. Trauma, thus, can deprive the collectivity of a critical resource, social and cultural renewal," unquote. So with this, is it possible to near the explicit subsection of conflict that reverberates through a family structure in which the children embody parallel mental structures to their parents, but live a vastly different material reality? And in this diagram that I created quite quickly, I delineate the split and the merging between these two generational experiences. This type of conflict veers most towards the psychoanalytic definition of what is called intersubjective conflict, which is a form of conflict that emerges within a shared psychological field, or in Mannheim's words, a temporal merging between subjects, neither purely internal nor purely external, based on inferences, intuitions, etc. So the basis of this memoir relies on the idea of literature as an effort to bridge a generational gap. Similarly, French analysts Nicolas Abraham and Maria Torok, originally Hungarian, turned to the reparative and therapeutic function of language after experiences of great pain. Language acquired in infancy to, quote, "fill the emptiness of the mouth with words," end quote, is at the core of their model. Through language, we enter the shared world of others, a community of empty mouths. In the same vein today, I apply the prism of linguistic malleability to exilic and post-exilic literature from the first generation and second generations, respectively. I grew up immersed in the Sephardic Judaism of my Moroccan father, which is what essentially sparked my interest in general. After he immigrated to France from Casablanca, following in the footsteps of more than 850,000 other Jews from North Africa. It is the act of transmitting one's roots, as he and the great majority of Sephardic Jewish communities sought to do, that propagate my main questions today. So just for some context, after 2,000 years in the Maghreb, nourished by Phoenician, Amazigh, Arab, Spanish, and Portuguese cultures, Jews left North Africa following the independence and decolonization movements, mainly between 1954 and 1967, due to a variety of different motivations, some being monetary, overwhelmingly, the establishment of the State of Israel, rising anti-Semitism, especially in Algeria, the recession of French colonial presence in North Africa, etc. And these groups immigrate to Palestine, France, Canada, as well as North and South America. And the social and psychological consequences of this exile resulted in two waves of exilic literature, which is exactly what I mean by first and second generation. So the texts produced by the first generation of authors were contextualized by their lived colonial, expatriated, and immigrant histories. Tartakovsky's work proposes that in this migration, the shock of exile contributed to the emergence of writing with explicit social functions, providing both comfortability and a working acculturation into host societies. One of the main topoi of this literature is the sentiment of being neither here nor there, and in between two cultures, two mindsets, two countries. Feeling like intermediaries or guardians, authors from the first generation articulate an obligation to safeguard the practice of their family's traditions or pay homage to their roots. In other words, a feeling of loss inhabits the writer's works. Alternatively, this feeling persists in a residual form in the second generation of women writers of Jewish and North African origin. The following group of authors wrote in response to this enigmatically affective, living memory of their parents' past, cultures, and recounts of their natal countries. The character of the sense of loss escapes articulation, more often than not, particularly since the second generation had grown up in a family, household, and community with very specific customs, almost as if to say, North Africa, far from North Africa. While the first generation locates its loss in a lived and concrete departure, the second lives it in a profoundly ungraspable sense, as a transmitted memorial legacy. In the context of this research, my central question is as follows. How does the second generation experience a memorial inheritance transmitted in a distinctive way as compared to the second generation? And how is their literature an example of the way that they metabolize it? To address this, I draw on Freudian psychoanalytic notion of melancholia, which aptly characterizes the experiences of the first generation. Contrastingly, I build on psychoanalytic frames and gender and sexuality theory, as well as Marian Hirsch's theory of post-memory, to propose the term post-melancholia, intending to capture the latent affective and emotional elements of inheriting a corporeal past, passed on from one generation to the next. The processes of othering, when extended to the context of biculturalism and transnationalism, reshape notions of embodiment, fantasy, and assemblage in the literature of second-generation women writers of Judeo-Maghrebi origin. The main mechanisms of conflict within and between these two groups vary. To begin, for the first generation of women writers, the bodily experience of death, displacement, and uprooting, as well as the symptoms they provoke, such as doubling and in-betweenness, permeates the reflections and literary texts. Out of the complexity of immigration emerges the persistent feeling of having left something behind, whether it be part of themselves, familiar communities, or long-held customs. This feeling, compounded by the profound disruption of daily life, often gives rise to a form of ego partitioning that splits them into two, in order to adapt, transform, and reconfigure themselves within the context of a new country and a new way of life. They're compelled to negotiate continuously with a collective self, the one rooted in their country of origin and one reshaped in France. For example, Katja Rubinstein, born Katja Tayeb in Tunisia, describes her immigration to France as a face-to-face encounter with nothingness. The preservation of memory through writing, as Rubinstein practiced, highlights how exile creates the propulsion to memorialize. Sociologist Abdelmalek Sayad described the émigré-immigré condition as one of in-between place, in-between time, in-between society, defined by a double absence. Absence from the country of departure, yet equally absent from the country of arrival, where marginalization is immediately enacted. This framework situates the first generation of Judeo-Maghrebi authors' drive towards memorial preservation and transmission as a reflex against cultural and geographic rupture. For first-generation women writers, this imperative to remember and transmit arises directly from the embodied experience of loss and dislocation. Writing, whether a memoir, novel, or reflective text, becomes an exposition that weaves an experience of intense and intimate rupture into an intersubjective symbolic system of language. Their texts are a subversion of alienation, which is a potent prerequisite to living in a country of exile. Once subjective elements are verbalized, they claim a part in the intersubjective symbolic system of language, as opposed to remaining isolated. Similarly, Cixous articulates this loss together with the ethical imperative to write in order to preserve memory of the deaths one has witnessed pre, post, and during exile. She situates this imperative within her own childhood in Clos-Salambier, recalling the cemetery she would pass daily on her way to school. Noting this memory as her first encounter with death, she writes, "Writing helps us find the primitive picture again, because when writing comes in contact with death, we remember it as a scene. We are observers, and we recount what we saw. Writing is learning to die. It's learning not to be afraid, to live at the extremity of life, which is what the dead death gives us." For Cixous, to write with the dead in mind is to write without the loss of her birthplace. Writing thus assumes a preservative function, resisting the uprooting effects of exile and immigration. For many Jewish Maghrebi women writers, exile entails leaving the country of birth and negotiating between past and present lives through the practice of writing. Cixous herself anchors her work in her Algerian childhood, as seen in many of her literary texts. She writes, for example, in her text Mon Algériens, quote, "Leaving one's father's grave behind, through dust I acquire a kind of invisible belonging to a land to which I am linked by my atoms without nationality. An abandonment holds my memory on the unvisited heights of Algiers." Confronting death and the separation from homeland becomes, for Cixous, the very ground of memory in exile. Taken together, these elements point to a profoundly embodied experience of departure, the psychic split that follows an overwhelming corporeal rupture of leaving one place for another, or being made to leave. José Esteban Muñoz locates this methodology in queer theory and memorial activism, describing that the work of remembering transforms trauma into a site of elastic, survivable, and livable identity. His analyses are pertinent due to their relation to the AIDS crisis, which claimed the lives of 700,000 men and women in the United States between 87 and 98, elaborating on the constant remembrance of the dead as a generative form of stability in the aftermath of loss, exile, or being made peripheral, being made to be other. Sustaining the dead through writing can be read as a mode of transcultural negotiation, essential to continuity, play, and intersubjectivity. As part of the first generation, Rubinstein and Cixous articulate an awareness of their social stratification, neither fully French nor fully North African, and necessarily attempt to redefine themselves away from the pervasive standards of assimilation. The more diffuse sense of loss experienced by the second generation of women writers is, in fact, partly due to the ravine of differing life experience, contingent upon factors such as colonial history, rendering the second generation with an experience of secondhand colonialism, secondhand urgency, secondhand exile. Moreover, the second group lives tangibly between the norms and standards of the family home and the norms and standards of the surrounding society. In most of these authors' novels, stories, and testimonies, the effect of the dominant society or country of exile in which they were born is deeply linked to the feeling of colonization and the loss of a reality, as well as the fantasy of moving radically closer to the culture of the dominant society. In the case of the Judeo-Maghrebi writers, the dominant culture, France, is synonymous with the colonizing entity of their parents' natal countries. For example, in her novel Sepharad, which draws extensively on her own life, Jewish Moroccan writer Eliette Ebekassis portrays the imposter syndrome experienced by her protagonist Esther. Of all permutations of success, Esther explains, her family valorized one, integration into French society. This pressure generates a pervasive confusion. Esther is closely monitored by her strict parents, granted limited freedoms, expected to fulfill all family obligations, especially around religious observance. At the same time, she is encouraged to adopt French culture. In response, and perhaps a way of rejecting her parents' lingering sense of in-betweenness, Esther attempts to embrace a French identity that denies her origins, all while balancing imposter syndrome. As such, it can be observed that the second-generation position structurally inherits a residual version of imposter syndrome, the inheritance of an experience of colonization transmitted across generations, perhaps felt as a form of colonization by proxy. orbiting, rejecting, and inhabiting her obligations to her family and the Moroccan Jewish community in Strasbourg, where the novel takes place, comes to a close when Esther visits her parents' town in Morocco, finding value in her heritage and a renewed sense of belonging. Similarly, Rebecca Ben Hammou's Les Habitués du Temps Suspendu discusses protagonist Lila's travels to Algeria in search of her father's memories. Lila experiences an urgent yet elusive desire to grasp her origins, unraveling the fraught dynamics of identification with family and tradition. She writes, quote, "That country, I carry it within me in a way that is almost inexplicable," end quote. This affective disjunction, markedly different from the first group of authors, gives way to a symptom of fleeting, evanescent melancholia. In Ben Hammou's novel, both characters are bound to Algeria, the father through memory and mourning, Lila through longing and absence. The protagonist confesses that, quote, "It's a country I carry within me. I don't even speak the language. The day that my father left, as in he passed away, he said goodbye to me in Arabic, and I didn't understand it at all," end quote. She finds solace in seeking her origins though her relationship remains fragile with them, constantly elusive and in flux. The first generation might accept exile within mourning, while the second inherits a restless, exile-inflicted melancholia, suspended between Frenchness and foreignness. Finally, Caroline Boidier's narrative offers a rereading of the destructive legacy of French colonization in Algeria through the divided experience of David, the Jewish protagonist, who, by virtue of his French citizenship, resides in Paris for years before returning back to Algeria, his natal country, to visit the grave of his former lover, a Muslim woman, Malek. His reflections render the psychic fissuring that exile forced onto him. Boidier writes, "I had been torn from Malek's body for Leah's, from Algeria for France, from the Jew of Batna for an extinct race in a land of asylum. Because I was condemned for belonging both to the French and Arab worlds, I decided to return to colonial France," end quote. Here, France is not embraced as homeland through Boidier's lens, but entered as a condition of historical compulsion, the result of colonial logics that position Algerian Jews as both inside and peripheral. Boidier reformulates the impossibility of sustaining affiliations with both Jewish and Muslim communities, a dynamic that resonates with the writing of Cixous and Rubinstein from the first generation, who also foreground psychic division as the consequence of exile. At the same time, literature signifies, here, a symbolic site of return and the absence of lived continuity for Boidier herself as part of the second generation. By staging David's conflicted trajectory, the narrative performs a metaphorical re-entry into the homeland of her parents, the natal country of her parents, mediated through memory and imagination rather than physical presence. For the second generation, melancholia and mourning functions as a mode of negotiation. At this interstice, the historical use of the term melancholia empties itself for varied signification, away from what Freud might have once said. Freud originally pathologized prolonged mourning, naming it melancholia. He argued that mourning, unlike melancholia, is a psychic process in which the loss of an object leads to the withdrawal of libido, which really just means commitment or desire from that object. When the loss occurs, the mourner gradually lets go, detaching slowly until one can finally declare the object to be dead and begin to reinvest in new objects. Freud's definition of melancholia is pathological precisely because it is a never-ending mourning, which is greatly contextualized by his own experience of Judaism. According to him, melancholia is characterized by a quote, "profoundly painful despondency, cessation of interest in the external world, inhibition of activity, and lowering of feelings of self-esteem," end quote. Asian American psychoanalysts David Eng and Shin-Hee Han puncture this definition in proposing the following idea. They ask, is it clear that not all immigrants are confined to melancholic or depressive states? If this is the case, how do immigrants negotiate their losses? How do their descendants inherit and inhabit these losses? Extending this term to racial and ethnic melancholia, they link it to alienation and potently to the loss of the fantasy of an idealized colonial life. Eng and Han's theorizations redefine psychoanalytic melancholia to be instead, quote, our everyday conflicts and struggles with the experiences of immigration, assimilation, or the expectation of assimilation, and racialization, end quote, emphasizing cultural multiplicity as opposed to integration. This framework opens up a renewed reading of Sephardic diasporic literature by underscoring the disparity between the first and second generations. The losses mourned by the first generation, such as homeland, family, language, education, or communal status, are both concrete and abstract. France's broken promise leaves these individuals suspended in an inaccessible cycle of mourning, unable to resolve or reinvest these losses into new ideals. The byproduct of loss and exile is a melancholia due to the inability to perhaps become the colonizer. The second generation might perceive its parents trapped within this cycle, or themselves by proxy, thus utilizing writing as a form of negotiating the imprints left on their self-conception. This complicates Freud's framework, which equates unresolved loss with pathology. Rather, melancholia can also signify a refusal to relinquish otherness, difference. This shifts the discourse from assimilation to duality, from pathology to negotiation. In the same vein, the second generation of authors inherit unresolved grief in latent forms, restaging their parents' ambivalence and their own struggles with integration and belonging. In this way, the second generation negotiates a double bind of their own: the pressure to assimilate and the haunting pull of inherited memory, a fragile yearning for heritage, an identity at once elusive and formative. This result is a symptom distinct from first-generation exile. It is an evanescent melancholia, rooted less in direct dispossession and more so in intergenerational transmission. Analyst Samuel Kimball's offers a term that weaves together the balancing of subjective realities, a glitching kind of melancholia, which he calls the phantom narrative. Exile thus creates not only spaces of mourning and melancholia, but an ongoing negotiation between them across generations. If the term melancholia can be used to describe an intergenerational discourse and a reparative relational movement that can transform the direct experience of immigration or colonization, the term post-melancholia, which I propose here, can characterize the second generation of Judeo-Maghrebi women writers. In formulating the idea of post-memory, Marianne Hirsch proposes that children of survivors do in fact have memories of their parents' suffering. She specifically treats the Holocaust and its historical moment. In this, post-memory and intergenerational transmission acts as a living link between generations. She writes that memory signals an affective link with the past, a sense precisely of material living connection, and it is powerfully mediated by technologies such as literature, photography, and testimony, end quote. In between, or being in the in-between position, which the receivers of post-memory find themselves, thus refers directly to the sense of surreptitious, latent loss, particularly as a result of the problems associated with marginality. To address the rupture that emerges from the inheritance of generational trauma, Hirsch follows a similar line of intersectionality to that which we have covered with Munoz, Eng, and Hahn. And particularly, she treats literary analysis, integrating clinical studies and psychoanalysis, as well as queer and feminist theory. She writes that, quote, post-memory could work to provide a platform for activist and interventionist cultural and political engagement, a form of reparation, inspired by feminism and other movements for social change. I turned to the study of memory because I was convinced that, like feminist art, writing, and research, it offered a means of discovering and restoring life experiences and narratives that would otherwise remain absent from the historical record, end quote. The devotion and responsibility to comprehend and preserve cultural heritage that characterize second-generation Jewish Maghrebi women writers mirror Hirsch's hypotheses. The author's works, like feminist and emancipatory movements, act as a form of embodied counter-history that opposes oblivion and erasure. Thus, if post-memory is the act of intergenerational transmission of memories, traumas, and remembrances, post-melancholia proposes renewed readings, a re-narrativization of grief. And to quickly conclude, to return to our point of departure, we could imagine, in an almost revolutionary gesture, what the concept of intersubjective and communal forms of self-conceptualization might look like. The experience of assuming post-memory and post-melancholy rewrites marginalization without ousting the figures or specters of a lived or inherited past, identifying conflict so as to host opportunities for interrelationality and reparative work to unfurl. The assemblage of different practices to create new forms of connection has always been fitting and specific to the foundation of Jewishness as practiced in its diaspora in the past as well as in the present. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laetitia, for this wonderful talk. Now is the time for questions. I have a few of my own, but I would prefer rather to open the floor for everyone here in the room. Yes, Eva? Please go. Okay, so maybe, yes, do you want to start? You were just raising the hand, yes. Do you have a mic? No, you don't. Okay, so I share mine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those both wonderful presentations. To the second one, I have a very, very simple question. Do you think that we can apply, because Cixous and Derrida in particular, they apply the notion of the Marano and the Maranic reading to their experience, do you think that it is more than metaphorical, substantial to say that the exile of the Sephardic Jewry particularly reactivated the Maranic complex and this old experience of being exiled like from the Catholic Spain and Portugal? It's a very seemingly simple question. And if they understand their position, some of them more than Cixous and Derrida in this way, that's like a reactivation of this traumatic potential from the very long past. And thanking for the first presentation, which was very rich and like so nicely crafted when it comes to words, and the words were moving in your presentation like a pendulum. I have a question to this specific formulation written in the riddle in the riddle, as concerning the relation of the father and the daughter. And forgive me if I if I add my interpretation to your beautiful reading of those stanzas, but it was so inviting in this way to open more and more to the pendulum movement of getting another aspects of this. So my very literal geographical reading of it or association was that we have Egypt, and actually it's like also a certain kind of reactivation of the very classical topos of going out of Egypt. And in the context that we have now, I was thinking actually about a certain painful paradox. So namely that the father carries this kind of a richness and fullness of life and of his being male as he saw himself, and now impoverished. So actually integrating into Israeli society and becoming a Jew in a certain elevated way, for him meant impoverishment. And in a way, he is lamenting over Egypt, so something that is banned. How to lament over my Arabic life as a Jew in the Arabic countries. And his daughter trying to come to him, as you nicely depicted, and in a very rich way. So she's, in a way, trying to rescue him or to make a tikkun, like repair or redeem his experience. Instead, we have an explosion of, like he showing his tragic experience, he wants her unwanted experience of her childhood. So this is a kind of a failed and impossible exchange of how a Jew can lament over leaving Egypt, that maybe something essential was lost, even though we came to the promised land. So that's my immediate association to your wonderful interpretation. Thank you once again.
Maybe I will follow after, because maybe we can. Sorry, no, it's just to I think I will maybe ask after the questions in order to try to keep the program to the point. But normally we have to finish, so we will have some delay. But in in 5 minutes there is a coffee break, so we can just go a little bit further, but not maybe too much extend the time. As I know both of you, I can ask.
Is there any other urgent question in the room, though? Yeah. No. Yeah. So we postpone the other questions to the coffee break. But now you do have time to answer that question. Shall we start with Laetitia now?
Yes. Thank you so much for your question. And I think the word reactivation is interesting. It makes me want to approach this question from a psychoanalytic angle, especially since, as we know, Freud says, anything that is experienced is never erased, is never forgotten. So the idea of reactivation, to me, almost maybe seems like a coming into consciousness, moving from the unconscious to the conscious. So, for example, the Murano experience, as Cixous and Derrida talk about prolifically, it's interesting because we could probably observe, regardless of if they decided to explicitly talk about this, there would be some kind of presence of this experience or this history in their work or literary texts of the same lineage, such as like the Sephardic diaspora. And in my mind, it would be not necessarily just because they perhaps reactivated it, but more just that they brought it into the work's awareness and situated the literary texts in their context, in their sociological spaces and times, and what they had inherited. So that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you so much. And now over to you, Piera.
You're perfectly right. I mean, this idea of the diaspora and the diaspora, of being not at home in Israel, but being in a diaspora in Israel, it's a topic that we can see in many other authors, right? And I'm thinking in particular of this rephrasing of the psalm on the river of Babylon, the river of sulle rive del Tigri piangevamo, etc. On the river of the Tigris, crying, sitting and crying, thinking about Jerusalem, right? But then the reverse by Ella Shochat, an Iraqi Jewish scholar, is precisely by the river of the Jordan. We were crying and sitting and crying, thinking about Babylon, so Iraq. So this idea of being in the diaspora, where you are supposed to be at home, it's something that it's a reading that we can for sure apply also to this case. And what's interesting more is talking about details, is that Cairo is mentioned in the poem. So your mother was the most beautiful woman in Cairo, but Tel Aviv is never mentioned. So we understand by other references, so Allenby Street, the bus number 7, we understand that she's talking about Jaffa, actually. So anyway, the seafront in Tel Aviv. But Tel Aviv is never mentioned. So the city which deserves to be named, actually, it's Cairo and not Tel Aviv. So this could also point to this idea to this that you were referring to. Yeah.
Maybe finally I am taking the mic. Maybe it's just a comment about what we are talking here. It's to reframe the notion of the diaspora, since, by the way, the founding of the Israeli state, what does it mean being in diaspora, is are as like some kind of general we, as Jews in the diaspora still are the Jews in the diaspora if they are living in different nation states and their other citizens. I mean, this is a more general question about reframing this notion of being in diaspora. What does it mean, and is it necessary diaspora? But it's just it's a comment, not a question. And I think that
it was a taboo. It was a taboo to talk in Arabic, to speak in Arabic, or in Israel. I mean, after the migration, it was a taboo language, but people would close the window and listen to the Arabic music and Kulthum, etc. In fact, what is interesting in this small collection of poems, actually, but the figure of the father, and we found the father in at least other 4 poems in this small collection, and in one is again sitting, etc., and listening to this Arabic radio programs in Arabic, and it's in another stage of his life, let's say. We have the gentleman, the French gentleman, in a first poem, and then you see a kind of, through these 4 poems, kind of the whole life of the man, until, and this is Laetitia, Ohayon, mentioned this book about. You didn't talk about care, but you used the word cure, right? But actually, in one of the last poem about the father is again sitting on the toilet and he cannot evacuate. And the daughter has to kind of help him, which is the most concrete act of taking care of somebody. Okay, nothing which. And so to which extent also poetry, literature can be a care word, where you take care of the father by recalling him, by guarding, in a way by keeping his recollection, his memories, but also concretely by talking also about this very also dirty reality of taking care of somebody. This is a further direction, but.
Thank you, Piera. Laetitia, you wanted to add something to that point, right?
Yes, just mostly a commentary. I would love to be in person to have had more to say, but I thought it was very, very interesting, the connection you drew between the bird as being worn almost on the chest as a sign of one degree of removal, or almost as this false idea of being tied to the state of Israel, feeling like belonging or non-belonging. And I was actually very struck by her usage of the word "a broken broom," or the phrase, and especially with the idea of the bird, the red bird, that's very decoratively appearing. And it almost reminds me of a phoenix, and sort of the idea of the broom and the phoenix as part of sort of magical stories or the fantastical realm was very striking to me. And I was wondering if, I don't know, the element of the dream of maybe belonging one day, of the homeland, of this messianic idea of being saved and accepted finally, was something you had explored in your literary reading and analysis.
Yes, you might have a final word if you want.
Very final word. I didn't manage to talk about the second question, and the second question, of the paper. Actually, it's I said memory sits in details, and memory takes place in this detailed description of the Saturday afternoon or evening walks. And actually, there are 2 stanzas devoted to this description, and the sea, and the color, and the lights of the city, etc. And she's dreaming, actually. So talking about the phoenix and the broom and the magic, she's in a dream because suddenly it's the father that say, don't remind me of those walks. Your mother hated me. And you see, and she is actually awakened by this sentence of the father. So for the space of 2 stanzas, she's actually in a sort of dream. And so thank you also for the comment, because I will add it.
And on this note, we will finish the panel, but we can continue the discussion during the break. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.